Columbia University, and they were having a fairly heated exchange about Palestine and Israel. And at one point, Joseph Massad made this comment about how Israel was practicing a kind of supremacist, ethnic supremacist politics. And Benny Morris was outraged by this suggestion of a supremacist politics. But his objection to this description was very revealing. And this is what Benny Morris said in response. He said, I hope you can kind of see it, he said, Israeli Zionists, this is Benny Morris speaking, would have much preferred Palestine to be empty of Arabs, with therefore no need for Jews to be supreme over anybody. They simply wanted a Jewish state. Okay, so this is Morris's response to the charge of supremacy. He was saying, well, actually, Israeli Zionists would prefer that it was just completely empty of Arabs, right? So this points to an important difference, and this is a difference that was picked up. I haven't put this here, but it occurs to me that it's probably a good thing to mention. This was picked up sometimes by observers who went from South Africa to Palestine, right, on a kind of fact-finding mission. And an editor-in-chief of a South African newspaper, after he came back from his trip to Palestine in 2008, he said this: "It seems to me that the Israelis would like the Palestinians to disappear. There was never anything like that in our case. The whites did not want the blacks to disappear." Okay, so he's pointing out a difference there, which is kind of highlighted here. Okay, South African apartheid was really kind of based on economic exploitation and a white minority exploiting the black majority for economic purposes. And in the case of Palestine, the core idea of Zionism wasn't that. It was to create, a state for Jewish people in Palestine, without any of the native people. Now that's kind of changed a little bit, especially post-67, because in the occupied territories, Israel suddenly kind of came in control of a lot more Palestinians. So a kind of economic exploitation relationship developed. Well, anyway, let's move on from that. The thing I really want to stress about using the term apartheid is that even if you put aside a comparison with South Africa and the similarities and the differences, you can assess what's happening by certain definitions of apartheid that exist in international treaties. Okay, so there's a test, putting aside any comparison with South Africa. In 1973, the UN General Assembly adopted the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. Okay, so they came up with a working definition of what this meant. The crime of apartheid was defined as acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And I want to stress there the nature in which it's a system. Okay, it's not isolated human rights abuses. These are things that are happening as part of a system. Examples: measures calculated to prevent a racial group or groups from participation in the political, social, economic and cultural life of the country, including the right to leave and to return to their country, the right to nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence. Okay, so remember, this is from a text of a UN General Assembly resolution from '73, talking about what does apartheid look like. Measures designed to divide the population along racial lines by the creation of separate reserves and ghettos for the members of a racial group or groups, the expropriation of landed property belonging to a racial group. And finally, before you get tired of these kinds of quotations, we've got another example from the International Criminal Court, part of the apparatus of that was adopted in '98. Again, another definition: crime of apartheid described as inhumane acts, and here's the key bit again, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. And just before we move on, I want to mention something which, again, maybe some of you have heard of. If not, it's worth looking up on the internet. This was published fairly recently, I think maybe 3 months ago, something like that, by a body called the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa. And it's basically a quite detailed report. I mean, it's a detailed legal report, so the executive summary, you can kind of get the main point from reading that. It's called Occupation, Colonialism, Apartheid. I just threw that up there because it's a good contemporary source to look at. And the interesting thing here is it's international legal experts analysing the situation specifically in the occupied territories and concluding that it meets, you know, the international definition of what apartheid is. So just to conclude that, before moving on to practical examples, I really want to emphasise, finally, you know, again, the comparison with South Africa, it's not how the use of the term apartheid in Palestine and Israel is to be ultimately tested. In the foreword to my book, the foreword was written by a guy called Professor John Dugard, who is a legal professor, South African legal professor, and he served as the UN's Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied territories, 2001 to 2007, I think it was. And he makes this point in the foreword. Ben White does not, however, say that South African apartheid and Israel's treatment of Palestinians are exactly the same. That is why he calls it Israeli apartheid. It is Israel's version of a system that has been universally condemned. All right, okay. So I'm going to move on from looking at, you know, unpacking that term apartheid a bit, to have a look at what this has meant and does mean on the ground for Palestinians. But I want to make a really important point, because I'm going to talk about some examples of Israeli policies inside Israel proper, right, and inside the occupied Palestinian territories. But note, more or less half of the global Palestinian population isn't under direct Israeli control because they're refugees, right? They were denationalized, dispossessed, and until now denied return. Okay, so remember that for half of the Palestinian population, the biggest impact of Israeli apartheid on their life is the fact that they can't go back to their country. So even though I'm going to be looking at, you know, examples of Israeli policies that impact Palestinians on the ground, I think it's really important to acknowledge this before doing that. And I'm going to divide it into two sections. I'm going to look at inside Israel, in other words, the pre-1967 borders, and I'm going to look at the occupied territories, okay, so West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. There's a very important reason for making this distinction, because Israel's regime of control is very different inside those two areas. There's a good reason for that, there's a number of reasons for that, but for me, the main reason for this, inside Israel, after the Nakba, after the catastrophe in Israel's creation, around 90% of all the Palestinians in what became Israel had been expelled. So if you imagine the community that was left, this was a community that had been completely shattered, right? Not only in terms of the fact that a small number of them actually remained, but, you know, the leadership structure was destroyed, basic social fabric, all that sort of thing. So that meant that Israel, although it had a body of Palestinians inside the state that became citizens, they're very much a weakened, fragmented minority. And of course, even though they're now 1 in 5 of the population, that's still a minority. And you could argue that, you know, until very recently, they hadn't really recovered, politically speaking, from what had happened in '48 and directly afterwards, which I'll talk about in a moment. The occupied territories, on the other hand, it's a Palestinian majority over a Jewish settler minority. So Israel's policies inside the occupied territories have always had to be more drastic in terms of control because of the population distinction, and of course the fact that, technically speaking, Israel has never annexed, with the exception of East Jerusalem, the occupied territories. Okay, so it's been a military occupation. So that's also defined the nature of Israel's control regime there. So I'm going to look at inside Israel to begin with. Those are just some pictures to kind of break up a lot of text. This picture up here, top left, I took that in May 2008, and it was the anniversary of Israel's creation, 60 years. And these are Palestinians inside Israel, remembering 60 years of the Nakba. Okay, and this is actually an annual march that takes place, organised by, let's see if I can remember the name, the Association for the Defence of the Rights of the Internally Displaced People, okay, which is basically an organisation that defends Palestinians inside Israel. And this is an annual march that takes place. I hadn't planned to talk about this example, but here I am doing it. It's an annual march that takes place of Palestinians